Here's where the fun part begins. I'm going to lower the opacity on that drawing and make a new layer beneath it. Now, what I like to do when I'm doing these kinds of studies is zoom out. And when you zoom out, you're not too caught up in detail. And once you're zoomed out, we're going to use a big brush. We're not going to go into detail just yet. In this case, the brush size is pretty much like one brush stroke could take up a quarter of the entire image. So use a really large brush. I'm going to squint, take a peek at the reference, and just grab the basic color of the background, because we're not going to paint the plate or that wood. We're just going to imply a subtle version of that scene. So we're going to grab this. And this is an example of how to simplify something if you don't want to paint everything in the background. Again, large brush. Just going to brush that in, kind of peek over. Yeah, it's roughly the right color family. Now, the apple being a sphere, this side is in shadow and this side is not. So to emphasize the focal point of the side of the apple that's lit, we're going to make the background behind the light side dark, because you'll notice how it stands out, and then the opposite in the background for the shadow side. This is kind of called checkerboarding, or one form of simultaneous contrast, which we'll get into later. Just as an example, if we just have a sphere in a box, and we shade this side to be dark and fade outward, shade this side to be dark as well. On the opposite side, notice the contrast when you zoom out, it really pops. So having said that, we're going to take that background. Let's grab that brush, that bristle brush really big. And this color that we just put in, we're going to make a dark version of it. And I'm going to start from the top and then press pretty hard and then move my way down to kind of create a gradient. I think it's important to practice your own pressure sensitivity so that you can kind of do perfect gradients on command if you want to. Cool, that works for me. A lot of oil painting, acrylic painting, gouache, sometimes watercolor will use this method where you're layering. Not so much with watercolor because you have to plan things out, but with gouache, acrylic, and oil, you can lay down colors and then build on top of it. In a sense, using not too many brush strokes, and that's what we're going to do here. When it comes to brush economy, we're going to use big brushes first and then carefully choose where the next strokes are as smaller brushes, so that you're aware of the economy of things. We're going to use that same color, but slightly darker and slightly cooler towards gray, and just paint in that shadow. Okay, now notice I went ahead and overlapped over where the apple's going to be, and it's perfectly fine because we're going to build on top of that. So if we make a new layer on top of that and just grab red, it doesn't have to be as accurate as the reference in terms of like which exact warm or cool red that we're going with. We're just going to get the impression of it. So I'm going to make sure I'm not going to go to the brightest red, but I'm also not going to go too dark. So it's going to be around here where it has enough saturation, because if you go too bright with red, notice it loses saturation because it'll go towards pink. And a note for that, if you want to increase saturation for something that's red, you'll introduce new colors like orange and yellow, kind of make it look like it's still maintaining saturation. Regarding brush economy, again, zoom out, large brush. We're just going to put one big red circle right there. And we're almost done. We are almost done. Can you believe it? And from here, what I'm going to do, based on our previous lessons, we talked about value relationships and halfway to black. So we're going to take that value and go halfway to black and shift it towards cool. So it's going to be a little bit over here in the magenta area. Make a new layer. And remember that core shadow that we put, we're just going to do one brush stroke on that core shadow. That's it. All right. It's really that simple. And then over here, on this shadow side, we're going to go smaller, obviously, because it's a smaller area, and just put one more brush stroke where that shadow is. This is brush economy. You're simplifying where the brush strokes are going to go at the focal points in order to simplify the whole viewing experience. Now I'm looking at it and I'm squinting at it, and I'm noticing that the red base that we started with is too dark. So when I squint and look at the reference, it goes towards yellows and pinks. So let's go ahead and make another layer between that base and between the shadow that we just put on. I'm going to select that color and I'll go brighter this way, but I'm also going to go warmer towards orange. And we're going to use one big brush stroke in this area and just lay that in like that. I'm going to actually make that brighter. A little bit more towards yellow, squint. And one brush stroke, a little bit more to the left. Now, if you do this kind of practice carefully choosing where these brush strokes go very slowly, when it comes time to do something quickly, it'll be much easier rather than trying to figure it out later on. If you can paint it slowly, you can paint it quickly. And then over here is going to be another highlight. And this is pretty much just a setup, by the way. Once we have these big broad strokes in, we're going to blend them. So we're going to zoom in a little bit more, and then we're going to lay in that highlight. A brighter color, but I also want to shift the hue towards yellow. I'm just going to squint and look at approximately where it is, and one brush stroke. And as we zoom out, it's starting to take shape, right? And from here, we could start being more specific with our actual painting. Because over here in the top left of the apple, that should be bright. So let's go ahead and grab that color again. And by the way, the reason I have had it zoomed out, when you're painting, it's ideal in the learning process to be able to get the thumbnail to look almost like the reference, or to at least look indicative of the reference when it's zoomed out, although as though it's almost done, but it's a tricky process. So let's grab that color and fade downward a little bit. And here we're going to start blending. So what I'm going to do is just select by holding Alt to actually merge all this color stuff down. Select not the darkest part, not the brightest, but somewhere in between. Look for like a color that's in between, and just loosely and lightly with your pen pressure kind of paint in. So kind of carefully painting in. You could keep your strokes actually pretty linear, like as in straight lines, and that will actually also, you know, imply style. Okay, just gonna ping pong my eyes back and forth with the reference. And I'm not trying to be too accurate. I just want the form to read as though it's an apple. This part is all in light. And again, now we zoom out. Is it reading like a spherical object with some deformities into it? Yeah, it's working. And that's part of the checklist. Zoom out. You could even turn the line work off. And if it reads like a 3D object, then I think you're on the right track. It's being very selective with these brush strokes and just slightly conforming to that line work that we set up. Now, notice here, right underneath the apple, there's this kind of really dark contact shadow as well as ambient occlusion. So we're going to introduce that into our painting. Let's grab this and go pretty dark. And we're going to go slightly towards magenta so that it's slightly cooler. And here's a technique that that you can do that's pretty effective. If you just make a brush stroke like this and another one like that, you might say, well, hey, we're taking over the whole piece here with this. But if you just use the eraser with that same bristle brush and then erase out where you don't want that and fade in like this, you zoom out, oh, it starts to look a little bit realistic, right? Let's turn off the line work and kind of see how that looks. It's getting there. Pretty impressive, isn't it? Let's go ahead and clean up these edges outside of the canvas here. Not the canvas, the line work. The framework. Okay. This stem actually has a cast shadow, and this is just a huge lesson on indication. So we're going to grab the shadow color here, not the darkest, because the darkest would be down here somewhere, but something over here, because you'll notice that this shadow is not too dark. Lay that in. It's a little bit dark. Make it a little bit brighter.